So, now we come to this next level. Now, covenantal is just, it's basically the next layer of context. Now, before we go, I do want to mention, and it's kind of implied here, there are some other details in the story that we didn't include, that you could include here with David, and we don't want to overlook this, right? He's got a sling and some rocks, right? And this is what he has. He goes out to, and that's, I mean, we know that part of the story so well, right? But it's an important part of the story, not because of the significance of the 5 rocks. As I often say, if you're going to go out and face a giant with rocks, you may as well take 5, right? And I think that's how many he was able to pick up. I've heard lots of arguments for why the number 5 is significant. I've never heard one that can be supported well from the biblical text. So, either way, to think that that number is the sort of turning point of the story, right? So even if we would somehow disagree on the significance of 5 rocks, this story is not an allegory. There's nothing allegorical in the story. That doesn't mean like it has to be an allegory, right? So when Jesus goes out into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days, that's not like an allegorical 40, but it's connected, right? It's sort of a typological. That's a typological connection. I just don't see any 5 significant things here, right? I think 5 is the number that fit in his hand. It's just a number, right? I've had people really, really want to discuss that with me ad nauseum. And I basically just end up saying, you're probably right. And that's it. So, if you think if you think that there's a specific biblical reason for 5 rocks, you are probably right. Whatever your basis is. Right? So, as we move up to this level, now, this is kind of tricky because you know what I said earlier about you want to fill in all the details? Here's the key to doing this way, is you're being selective. Now this gets really important up here because as I've said, there might, I mean maybe not in this story, but in some stories you're talking about this sort of redemptive or canonical level, there might just be 1 or 2 things to say. But the thing is what you want to do from here is these serve as anchoring points that go directly up to here. And it's really at this level you can get lost the most because on one level you could say, what is this? It's everything that took place before. And it is, but what you're wanting to do is sort of plug in the specifics that connect to things down here. Right? As much as you possibly can. But at this level, it's really important that you don't just be general about things. Like, I want to know, and you want to know, specific things, right? Not just Israel as a nation or something, right? And there's going to be a lot of things today that I'm going to put up here, just they're very, very general, basic things. Now, what are some significant things from the covenantal sort of historical level? And I say covenantal, not just historical, because these events have to be covenantally interpreted, not just historically interpreted. You know what I mean by that? That is, these are set in a particular theological and covenantal context. They're not just historical. I mean, it's all historical, but it's particular to a covenantal revelation from God and relationship between God and Israel and promises and all kinds of other things like that. Right? So it is, because it's biblical, this is theological. Right? It's not simply sort of historical facts and figures. Okay? Right? So it's historical facts and figures that are theologically and covenantally significant. So, okay? So, what are some things flowing into this text at the covenantal level. And again, these things can crisscross. They can move back and forth, and you can have things that fit on more than one level. The levels, the levels are synthetic, right? I mean, that in other words, I've sort of constructed them. But of course, in a story, they overlap constantly, right? So, in other words, don't take this sort of schematic, like don't imagine a story like according. But we have to have some tool by which we distinguish things, right? So in that sense, there's always going to be sort of a synthetic element to doing this. But what are some really significant, specifically significant things that inform your reading of the David and Goliath story? Yes? Yeah. In 1 Samuel 16, actually I need to move up a little bit. 1 Samuel 16, David is anointed, right? So we're moving up from David here. He's already anointed. Not many people know this, of course. You know it. Think how much better equipped you are to understand the events between David and Goliath because you are a Bible reader and not somebody who's living at the time. Right? You know way more than they could have ever known, by and large. Right? Because you have you get the bird's eye view of the entire thing. What else?
Saul was chosen to be king partly because of how much bigger he was than the rest of the Israelites.
Yeah, and that's in 1 Samuel 10, if I'm not mistaken. He is anointed king. Now, I don't know if it's 10. That doesn't sound right to me now. Is it 10? Okay. Now, before we move on from that, well, okay. I'll hold off. There's something a connection I want to make, but I can wait. Yeah. Yes, that's a really important thing, right? Between these two things, you have 1 Samuel 15, where you find out that God has rejected Saul. Now, knowing those three things is virtually enough to transform the way you read this story. Instead of reading the story in a vacuum of just one chapter. Right? Now, at this point, I'm not trying to answer all the whys and wherefores of these things happening, right? Not yet. I mean, that would come later in the sort of process of interpretation. Right now, I'm just trying to read the story. Does that make sense? So I'm making note of this. I'm like, well, how does this work out on that level, this level? That's really important, but that's not part of this particular process. What else? Yes. Where did that come from? That's really important on lots of levels. Now, why is it important when they want a king?
They want to be like other nations.
Yes. They want to be like other nations. Anybody know where this takes place? What chapter? Yeah, you got like 8, 9, and 10 are where you sort of put these things together. They come and they demand a king. This is in 8, 6 through 9. I mean, it's the whole thing, but listen to this. This is Samuel, or about Samuel. When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord said to him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king." Now, that is as significant a covenantal fact as you need to know for this whole entire story, right? And it really fills in the background for what is going on in the sort of practices and character of Israel and Saul and the others, right? Even the first choosing of Saul. Now, I'm going to connect this back to something else in a minute that makes the whole thing, you have to really sort of sit down and consider what's going on. Just the fact that they have this king. And he goes on to say, they're doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt. Now, there you go. There is the commentary. There's the commentary that you need to understand exactly what Israel is doing that day, those 40 days, whatever, in that valley. It comes right from God, right to Samuel. You know what you're seeing? What I've been seeing since the day I saved them. I mean, that will change the way you read the story, and it will significantly change ultimately what you have to say to people about this story. And it just comes from reading the Bible. That's it. There's no sort of trick here. There's not like some kind of analytical method. The method here, I keep calling it a method. The method is reading. That's it. The thing that is easiest for us to do, the thing that we neglect more than any other duty we have as seminary students, reading the Bible. And I was a seminary student. I'm still in seminary, so I'm not just throwing a rock at you, or 5. Rock from the Kidron Spring, right? From the actual place. You're like, do you always have that in your bag? I do. I never know when there might be giants. But I only carry 1 because I know the story. You don't need 5. 1 is all you need. So I carry 1 with me. Any giant I meet, he's all mine. I'll even throw it left-handed. Okay. So, we got this part of the story. Now, what's in Deuteronomy 18? Has nothing to do with this story. That's what? No. I was hoping somebody would say that's where there's a prophet like Moses, because we're familiar with that chapter, more familiar with Deuteronomy 18. For this story and the whole story of the history of the kings of Israel, Deuteronomy 17 is your go-to chapter. But we don't know it as well as Deuteronomy 18 because of the prophet like me business, right, with Moses. What happens in Deuteronomy 17 is God knows what's going to happen. He knows when they get in the land, you know what they're going to do? They're going to want a king just like the nations around them. See, it's not essentially the issue of they want a king. It's they want to be like what? The pagan nations around them. What does that say? That, yeah, they don't trust that God is everything to them. But God, nevertheless, from generations earlier, gives them provisions for how to select this king when they decide God is not enough for us, we want a king of our own. God actually tells them, all right, when you get in the land and you want a king of your own so you can be like the nations, here's what your king should be like. And he immediately paints a picture of a very specific sort of king. And you get this in Deuteronomy 17. Verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God has given you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. So God already knows, right? And he's going to use this for one of the most significant developments in the history of redemption in the whole Bible. That is a king over them in the line of David. Because they first asked for a king because they're not trusting God. You have to sort of sit back and think about that for a while. Right? I mean, talk about, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Right? This is a sort of this is a big level example of that very thing. And so, okay, you are to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Appoint a king from your brothers. You are not to set a foreigner over you or one who is not of your people. However, he must not acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses, for the Lord has told you, you're never to go back that way again. He must not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart won't go astray. He is not to acquire very large amounts of silver and gold for himself, right? If you're thinking already of Solomon in terms of, wow, Solomon had those things. Wow, Solomon also did those things. Remember, God gave all those things to Solomon. Why? Because he asked for wisdom. But it turns out Solomon's not a great guy because he not only gets lots of wives, what does he do? He gets a foreign wife and builds what? Right? Pagan places of worship where? In Israel. You don't get a lot of Golden Age kings in the history of Israel based on Deuteronomy 17. You only get one. And he's not a Golden Age king either. It's as close as you get. And we're reading about him in this story, by the way. David and Goliath. Not quite done here. Here's the important thing. When he is seated on his royal throne, he is to write a copy of this instruction, that is the law and statutes, for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It is to remain with him, and he is to read from it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe all the words of this instructions, and to do these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. Remember Solomon's son? What was his name? Rehoboam. What did he say? You think my dad was something? Strap yourselves on. He basically says you ain't seen nothing yet in terms of how strong and harsh somebody can be. Right? So, I know that's further down the road, right? But I'm just sort of thinking ahead of. Then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from the command to the right or to the left, and he and his sons will continue reigning many years in Israel. That is Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20, and you would want to, make note of that. I'm writing this completely backwards, right? That's the weirdest way anybody's ever written a citation, the history of biblical citations. I guess I could have started with a colon first, right? But whatever the case, that sets the scene for everything that's going to take place in the David and Goliath story. Because you find out from God himself what a king should be like. Now, there's other generalized things you can say here too, but I'm going to wait till we get up here and show you really starts to kind of overlap. There's lots of overlap here and here, but for the purposes of trying to make this make sense, I'll hold off. What else helps us understand this story? I've already mentioned this before, right? That the Philistines, they should have been taken care of in the conquest, but they weren't, along with everybody else, generally. Is there a text? The text that starts this whole thing, there is a text, is, I'll just put the chapter number. Numbers 13. What happens in Numbers 13? Anybody know? Yeah. The spies go over, and now, where do they go? Yeah, what land? Yeah, they go into Canaan. What should they have seen? They should have seen God keeps his promises. Yeah, or you could put it that way. What do they come back and say? God doesn't know what he's talking about. That's a commentary. That's sort of an interpretive take on their comment when they come back and say, you know what, they're giants. Now, they come back with lots of really huge grapes and stuff like that. And there's evidence. But my interpretation of it is they come back and say, yeah, I know what God said, but those people are huge. We ought not go. That's what they do. And everybody goes along with them. Right? Well, not everybody. Yeah.
I was also going to add that in Joshua, he commands them to not be afraid, but yet that's the very thing they're doing. That whole book is about the conquest.
Yeah.
And failure to conquer.
That's a great point. And I was going to add that to this, right? Because you get in Joshua chapter 1, here's a trajectory. In Joshua 1, you got this thing, be strong and courageous. Choose this day. What are you going to be like? Your father's pagan worshipers across, I think he's we're going all the way back to the fathers' fathers, like Abraham, and like they were across the river, or you're going to trust God. I mean, that's sort of a paraphrase, but that's what's going on. And then in the Joshua story is a very mixed bag of sort of going back and forth between, okay, we'll do this, and whoa, I don't know what we're getting into here. That then finally resolves into just the chaos of Judges, right? So that's exactly right. So you have a whole history, and now remember, it's not just a history. It is a covenantal history where God comes to them and says, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt. In other words, the Ten Commandments begins with a covenant declaration, not simply here's 10 things you need to do. These 10 things I'm telling you, right, which are just a summary of the whole law, is all about this relationship that they have with God. They need to believe, what they need to do is believe that God rescued them from Egypt. If they believe that, then certainly they can believe what? That he can rescue them from all those giants in Canaan. Do you understand? Right? What you have is a history of unbelief among the Israelites, generally speaking. There's some high points, but the fact that you can name them in less than 5 fingers, right? Caleb, Joshua, Moses, who else? Jonathan. Well, I mean, before that. But no, you're right. Put Jonathan in there. Yeah, Samuel's a prophet. But I mean, among like the people, among the sort of wilderness generation, you don't get a lot of mention, right? Which tells you what? The author, Moses, is really focusing on what? National rebellion. In contrast to what? God's unending faithfulness, in spite of the fact that nobody is sort of doing their part on the Israelite side. This is all building into this story. So what you're seeing here, this story of David and Goliath is like, in some ways, a microcosm of the entire experience of Israel with God, which includes God's promise to do what he says he's going to do apart from their faithfulness. God keeping his promise is not conditioned on their faithfulness. He's going to do it. And you see him doing it here with this story of, where'd he go? The story of David. And there's lots of things we could say here, but I don't want this to go forever. You're getting this sort of idea. Anything else? You can think of? I mean, we've named the big things, right? About the rejection of Saul. Saul's been anointed. David's been anointed. You have Samuel in the background. So, I mean, I don't want this to get too kind of wild, but you can take this, you can make lots of different connections, all the way back to, I didn't put it up here, this would be a general thing, is you have, this is maybe, doesn't need to be said, well, actually it does. The covenant is a covenant of God's promise that he is going to be with them and go before them and fight before them, right? That's what he says. In Exodus 23, which is included in the sort of collection, not a collection, but in the quote that is anchored in Isaiah when John the Baptist comes and he says, right, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, right, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. That's a connection, sort of a collection of Isaiah, Malachi, and Exodus. Right, a messenger going before them. All three of those texts are kingly texts in their Old Testament context. In Exodus 23, God promises a messenger who will go before them, an angel who will go before them and do what? Defeat their enemies. From the very beginning. And they are doubting, but you have this, no matter how bad, and this is all sort of contrast, right? Comparisons and contrasts. No matter what's going on at this level, all the way down to the book of Judges, God's promise is what's keeping the whole thing going. Because if you read this, just take a step back. This is not always helpful to do. Take a step back and read this story and imagine you don't know the end from the beginning. There's not a lot of hope in the story. That's precisely I think, what we're supposed to take from this story. On a human level, it is hopeless. I don't care if you're David or what. And if you don't believe the thing about David, I got two names for you. Ultimately, Bathsheba and Uriah. It doesn't even stop with David, and he's the high point, right? So that's kind of flowing out of it. Now, inevitably, I know there's a question over here. Inevitably, somebody wants to know, do I include things here that come after? Well, you can, and they're probably going to end up bumping up a little bit. But so, for instance, with David, you think about Deuteronomy 17, you read Deuteronomy 17, now go read Psalm 1 again and see what you hear. It turns out, in my view, blessed is the man now that applies to anybody, but it is a little more specific. Because it sounds like what? The king from Deuteronomy 17. What follows Psalm 1? A major royal psalm. So you get sort of this character of the king that sounds like Deuteronomy 17. I'm not saying it only applies to David and the kings. It has larger application. But then right on the heels of it is Psalm 2. That's all about the coming Son of David, the Messiah. And you cannot read Deuteronomy 17 and read Psalm 1 the same way ever again. Because you can hear that sort of echoes. And it's flowing towards that. Wait, I had a question over here, and then I'll come back. Yes?
So how much is expected for us to include on this?
Well, let me talk about sort of specifics of how to do the assignment later. Okay? Because I'll need to sort of talk about formatting and all kinds of things, and we'll just take care of that at another time. Okay? When it gets closer. Yes? Yeah, at this level, you have to be pretty selective because there's so many analogies, right? But this is the great thing about this is, I'm not saying that you didn't think about this earlier, so, okay? But one of the things that thinking about this text this way is all of a sudden it opens up sort of the larger vista of like, wow, this is maybe the 159th time we've seen disobedience in the face of God's promises, right? Because, what does David do? Why is David so confident? Yeah. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Right? And what does he think he's saying to the Lord's army? And then David goes out. And David sounds like somebody who what? Who, I think I just generalized it down here, right? He's concerned for God. He sounds like somebody who believes God's promises. He sounds like somebody who says and believes God is who he says he is and is going to do exactly what he says he's going to do, just like he always has. So David, now, this story doesn't explicitly talk about David's faith, but it is on display because you have to have faith, right? You have to have faith that God is not just faith like, well, here it goes and try our best. You have to believe something about God to be a shepherd kid. I don't care how many lions and tigers and bears you've killed, to go out and face the greatest warrior of the time. That is faith, not sight, right? It really, really is. It's confidence, yes, but confidence in what? Confidence that, is it David having confidence like, hey, you put our stats up there and you'll see we match up. No, they don't match up at all. At all. But he goes out. And that's part of the big story. I saw a hand up there. Yeah.
This may be more minor, specific, covenantal thing, but when I was looking at Eliab, they note him as the firstborn. So it's kind of going against this idea that everybody would see Eliab as the
Yeah,
savior because he's the firstborn, but yet God chooses the youngest.
Yeah. He doesn't even choose the firstborn. Now, that should immediately sort of set things off in your mind. Think of another non-firstborn person who precedes David who turns out to be super significant. I was going to say Judah, right? Because Judah, right, he's the third son. It turns out what? His scepter, it will rule forever. And ultimately, who's in the right line of Judah? Right? Ultimately, it goes to Jesus through a significant amount of Gentile blood. But anyway, that's another thing. So you have this thing in the story that we often miss, right, because of the way we sort of hero everything. That is, remember, David is young, right? And he is a shepherd. He is not, in spite of the lions and tigers and bears incident, he is not a warrior. He isn't. Now, he's awesome with a sling, but when was the last time you thought, oh, look, this guy's trying to break into my house with a 12 gauge. I've got a slingshot. We're pretty much on even ground. Right? And that's part of the story. Now, that connects into a whole bunch of other stories that you can even see. I'll talk about this maybe if we have time. I don't know why I'm putting this in red. In the book of Judges is all about what? The most unlikely heroes imaginable do what? Sort of, in God's providence, keep the nation together. It is the biggest collection of you've got to be joking me characters in the whole Bible. Even Samson, right? Anything but sort of a poster child for faithfulness. Right? And I'll talk about Judges maybe in a little bit, about how you can kind of look at a whole book. Maybe I'll do this. I don't know if we have time. But anyway, all I'm saying is things like, this is in the past, right? Things like ox goads and jawbones and women with a tent peg. Come on. Is that the story you would have dreamed up? If it is, it's because we've domesticated it. It's all these unlikely characters who do what? Unbelievable things. Because the story is what? God is keeping this together because God is keeping his promises. That's what's driving this whole thing. Now, how does Israel survive that day? Yes, through a kid with some rocks. But the fact that it's with a kid through some rocks says what to you? God is the one at work here. Because don't ever forget, in a biblical narrative, there is always, and I don't care what the narrative is, there is always one character that is often spoken of, but is always, even unspoken, that is always there. The most ubiquitous character in all of, constantly present, character in all of the narrative of the Old Testament is who? God himself. Right? And he is present here, and you can see it in the most unlikely means of redemption that you can imagine.